Hello, everybody, and welcome to TGI Kubernetes, episode 180. Happy New Year. This is our first episode of 2022. How time flies, and doesn't it? I'd like to welcome everybody, and today is going to be a very special episode. We're going to be, in addition to sort of doing our regular sort of news of the week and going over sort of what's happening in the Kubernetes world, we're also going to be welcoming Rey Lejano. And I should have asked you before we started to make sure I'm pronouncing your name right. But let me go ahead and bring you on, Rey, and you can correct me and tell me where I'm messing it up. But real quick, by way of introduction, Rey's a field engineer for Rancher SUSE and Rancher Labs. But in this capacity, Rey was the release lead for Kubernetes 1.23. So welcome to TGIK, Rey. And correct me, what's the right way to pronounce your name? And again, I apologize for not asking you beforehand.
It's Lejano.
Lejano. Okay, yes. Awesome. All right. So I did butcher it. I apologize.
That's okay. And thank you for having me.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for everybody who's joining us. Usually it takes a little while for folks to come on board. And so we have Martin from the Netherlands and Prasad from cold and windy Chicago. I grew up outside Chicago. So yeah, I've definitely experienced that. Let's see. I'm from Cupertino, Sevi from Amsterdam. David, good to see you. Awesome. Yeah, it's so great to see folks who've sort of joined us on and off for so long and to still stick with us here. It's been an interesting transition for TGIK as we've been bringing on more hosts, and like with the pandemic, so many more folks are doing stuff like this and bringing folks on, and it's really good to see that having so much content, so many good things going on out there. Steve, good to see you. I'm from Israel. Good to see you also. Well, for those who aren't familiar, what we try and do with TGIK is we have some sort of crowdsourced notes, and I'm going to go ahead and start projecting these here. And if you want to go start looking at these things, they're available at tgik.io/notes. This is using HackMD. I love HackMD as a service. It's just super easy to get going with and lightweight. And so anybody who has things that they want to talk about, or as we're talking about stuff, if you want to add some pointers there, feel free to sort of crowdsource and add some stuff to the notes. But what we like to do is actually go through, hey, what are some interesting things that folks have seen over the last, week or two since the last episode? Do a little bit of kibitzing back and forth on that. Sometimes, folks in the chat will bring up new things that we might have missed that should be part of this. Like right as we're talking about this, I'm thinking I did see a tweet, and I'm trying to remember who tweeted it, that the virtual pass to KubeCon is on sale for like $10 right now. So I think I'll dig up that tweet, and we'll definitely make sure that we can get that on here too. But let's go ahead and get started. And Rey, you are definitely sitting on ground floor for some of these things, and so I definitely am looking forward to hearing your perspective on this. Let's start with the Docker shim deprecation. Now, we've talked about this on and off. If you're not aware of it, I'm surprised. But this is the idea that the sort of the special, super special adaptation code for the kubelet talking to Docker is moving out of being built in from the kubelet into something that's actually existing outside of sort of core built-in Kubernetes. Am I getting that right, Rey?
Yes, absolutely.
So tell me, so you said that you reviewed this this blog post, but also, there's been a lot of lessons learned through sort of like the journey of this particular deprecation, because it definitely did hit a lot of people really hard. Can you give me a little bit of color in terms of like, how people are approaching communicating this, and this one specifically, what are the concerns and what is some of the hangover from that initial communication?
Yeah, so Docker shim was deprecated in 1.20, but before 1.20 was actually released, there was a tweet out, because the draft release notes are always available. And, we are open source.
There are no surprises in open source,
yes, right? Absolutely. So there was a tweet out saying, hey, Docker shim's being deprecated. Before any big upstream communication or communication from upstream. So it came out and kind of became what kind of went viral, or kind of created a firestorm from it. So Docker Shim itself was deprecated in 1.20. Oh, it will be removed in 1.24. And because of this, we've had some lessons learned on communication. So part of the release process itself is that shortly after code freeze, the release team will publishes a deprecations and removals blog. So that's going to be on kubernetes.io. So before the actual release, several weeks, depending on when code freeze is at, we will have a blog post that will actually states what is being deprecated and what will be removed in the upcoming release.
So just really get those cliff notes out there in as clear a way as possible in terms of here's the things that folks need to be aware of.
Exactly. And we've had a few blogs published already on kubernetes.io about Docker Shim. There's an FAQ. There's been a few blogs since then. I think there's been 2 before this one and the FAQ. So we are going to continue the effort of communication with the Docker Shim removal. We're also going to do some changes on kubernetes.io to make sure there's proper migration docs as well on how to actually migrate from Docker Shim to other CRI compliant container runtimes like Containerd, Cryo, etc. So we'll have that ready. We want to make sure that the end users and the whole community is well aware of this removal and how to actually prepare for that removal.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting aspects of Kubernetes as an open source community is that, man, there's a ton of people using it and they're not as plugged in. I mean, they don't watch, they don't necessarily read the blog. They don't follow the Twitter accounts. They don't necessarily, watch shows like TGIK. And so it's really hard to get this message out there. And you really got to sort of broadcast it across all sorts of different, channels and communication mechanisms. And I think, there's language barriers associated with it also, right? I think, we're here speaking English, reading stuff that's English on here, but not everybody who uses Kubernetes is necessarily a native English speaker. So that's definitely something to take into account there also. So Icarus sort of like, this is an interesting question here. Would it be possible to add an end of life to the kubectl API versions command? So there are capabilities now, and I don't know when this is added recently, where some warnings can be returned, I think, as a header in API calls to Kubernetes, and then kubectl will actually display those. And so there is room to start notifying users of deprecations from the sort of, cluster user point of view. I think this particular one is kind of deeper and buried deeper than that. So I don't know if it would show up as part of a natural API call. It may be worthwhile to actually have a kubectl deprecations that hits an endpoint that actually does produce those things. That might be an interesting idea out of this.
Yeah, and I also put in the show notes as well. There's actually a deprecated API migration guide that was first published on kubernetes.io last year. So this is a page that we do maintain as well. So it's the very bottom of the show notes there. So you could see there.
Oh yeah, and this goes at it by things that haven't even been released yet.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
You can start preparing. Yeah. Awesome. Super useful. All right, great. Let's see. Hey, Carlos and Alex, and the other name there that I'm not going to try and pronounce, that's in Cyrillic. All right, so let's keep going here. So this is just kind of fun. I love seeing this stuff, and I know this came out a while ago. The date here is in October 2020, but multiple people have sent it to me. This is somebody, and I think this is, there's been some examples of this in the past of folks who've gone through and created a Kubernetes Minecraft connection. And I think in this case, I love this, like, pigs are pods, cows are replica sets, chickens are services, and horses are deployments, which I think is really cute. So it's always fun to see this stuff. And, this is the weird stuff that you get when you're, when you have an API, right? It's the magic of APIs is that people can do things that don't necessarily make sense, but are a lot of fun like this. Yeah. All right. Folks talking in the chat, which is cool. All right. So the next one here. So, that like one of the things that we're doing with Tanzu is we're investing in this tool set called Carvel around packages. It's all open source. I want to encourage a lot of folks to be able to take a look at it. But there's this really great blog post that really goes into the details around sort of how Carvel works, what we're looking at there, the different parts of it, and how Cap Controller works. And I think this is, if you're interested at all in this and why we're actually investing in Carvel and what our plans are there, this is some great stuff to really take a look at. And I think, one way that I explain this to folks is that, a couple things that I like about Carvel is that it's Unix philosophy in terms of small, sharp tools. It's a bunch of things that are built to work together. And so we're hoping, and, over time, we're going to see more and more tools, whether they're part of Carvel officially or not, that can start to be able to be composed with this, combined with this stuff also being with Cap Controller being very GitOps friendly, right? I think having CRDs for being able to say, I make it such that version XYZ of something is installed, and having that be supported as plain old, resources with operators, without having to install sort of outside kludges, is something that's definitely front of mind for what we're doing with Carvel too. So if you're interested at all, a good resource there to start digging into. Don't want to belabor that too much. Carlos says, I wonder if Dagger will have similarities with Carvel. I'm not sure what they have planned for Dagger. I did, get a little bit of a demo talking with Solomon about that. For those who aren't familiar, sort of like, was it Dagger.io? Is Solomon Hike's new company. The fascinating thing here is that, it's a lot of it is based on Q. And I don't know. I mean, so Ray, do you have an opinion on Q? Have you looked into it?
I have not, and I actually do plan to look in Dagger.io. I just got access to that board membership, so take a look.
Yeah,
at it
I'd
as
love to know.
well.
I mean, this is part of, again, open APIs is that there's so much room for folks to play around with different ways of doing things. And I think, at least one of the things we wanted to do with Carvel is separate out sort of how do you package and deploy YAML from how do you template it and customize it, right? Because there's multiple ways to customize it. And we want to make sure that we, hey, like we have YTT as one thing, using Starlark as a way to sort of template YAML. It's not the only way to do it. And we don't want to necessarily throw away the rest of the toolkit if we find something better or something that works for a different situation. So my opinion on Q, and I think we did a TGIK on it. I know I did one live at KubeCon at one point, is I think it's awesome. I love the work that's going on there. The type system is really interesting. I worry for this class of solutions, and I think Q is there. I think JSON is also there. It's just a different way of thinking and looking at things. And so for a lot of folks who are not, deep into this world, don't necessarily have a more formal computer sciencey background, the sort of the functional programming aspects of Q, I think, can really give people pause. And I think we see this with Rego, with OPA, right? It's not a procedural way of doing things. OPA and Rego is really a sort of a constraint language. And when you view it through that lens, it makes perfect sense. But most people view it as a procedural language, and they really get themselves twisted around the axle with that. And I think there might be some similar issues with Q. I see similar stuff with Nix and the way that people use Nix and program that. A lot of great properties, really cool technology. And also, holy moly, this is a whole different world that is kind of alien to a lot of folks. So that's my take on Q. And I assume that it's going to be interesting to see how Dagger adapts a bunch of this stuff. Yeah. YTT, I feel, is missing something about UX. I mean, the team would love to hear about that, Carlos. And so, feel free to reach out and give them that feedback. I'm happy to connect you. All right. So a couple of more things going on here. So IPv6 support. So one of the things I think we're going to be talking about in 123 is, dual stack IPv4 v6 is GA. Super exciting to see that happen. That's been a long time coming. And both EKS and AKS have announced, and I assume GKE is also supports it or has for a long time. So we're starting to see rollout of support of V6, which is really, really good to see. both in Azure and in EKS. And, you know, and I can give you sort of some historical context on why we didn't have v6 in Kubernetes earlier. And the reality is that when we were doing the original networking model, I think all of us were like, wow, if we had v6 support, like all this overlay stuff, you know, would really start to sort of fade to the background because we could actually do direct addressability, right? Because I think so much of the overlay stuff is really downstream of the fact that you don't have sort of unlimited IP addresses with v4. And at the time, the cloud providers didn't have great v6 support. I think, you know, Amazon at that time, you could have a public v6 endpoint with ELB, similar internally with Google, but actually having v6 support internally was just not well supported. And I remember being bitterly disappointed because the first editions of v6 support for EC2 were very limited. You could have individual IP addresses, up to like 20 of them, but what you couldn't get is a subnet assigned to your EC2 instance, which is really what we needed to be able to do the networking stuff for Kubernetes. So I think there's sort of been a little bit of a chicken and egg with sort of having the underlying platform support v6 and then having Kubernetes evolve to support it also. But it's really great to see this stuff coming together. So yeah, so congratulations to the teams on that. Any comments on that, Ray?
Yeah, I'll talk about some of the backstory as well with how services, how they used to, like, you had to have a service for an IPv4 and you had to have a service for IPv6. So you had a service per IP family, and that was refactored in I forgot what version it was, but yeah, I'll talk about it a little bit more when we go into like the enhancements for 123.
And I think this is something that, like, it's a lesson that I've seen again and again, and I think, you know, we tried to avoid it with Kubernetes, but apparently we failed, is that anytime where you have a singleton, it almost always is going to come and bite you in the butt at some point. Right. And I think, you know, there's definitely places in Kubernetes, especially around networking, where there was an assumption built in earlier that a pod has a single IP address. And you'll see that show up in, you know, in a lot of the YAML, and sort of like over time we're evolving that. But like this idea of like a service has a single IP address is built into that also. And then part of moving towards sort of the dual stack is really breaking some of those assumptions and breaking down singletons. And so one of the reasons why in so many places we went with labels and label selectors to create relationships in Kubernetes was to get away from that sort of like, hey, there is only one of something. Like anytime you have one of something, you're going to need n of something. It's almost like a truism in this world. And we did it in a bunch of places, but I think in networking is one place where we missed it. And it's taken a long time to be able to actually get to the other side of that. Yeah, Carlos is saying that like with private v4, there's a lot that you can do today. And, you know, IPv6 is niche. I would agree with that. But like, it's not unusual to have companies running out of 10/8 space, right? And I think, you know, you start seeing them start to steal, you know, private VP, you know, v4 space from some of the carrier blocks and all that. You start seeing some crazy stuff because, you know, hey, like you want to maybe, you know, give a subnet to every node and then make that directly routable. And then you have a bunch of Kubernetes clusters, and how many nodes do you have? Pretty soon you start eliminating huge chunks of your IP space. And so I think, I know like big production footprints, people are very careful about how they allocate, v4 space, and it's easy to get it wrong and it's painful to change. I'm sure as a field engineer, you've seen some of that stuff, right?
I've seen this before being a field engineer. I come from the ITIL consulting world from years ago, so I see this in like big internal networks as well, that they were very, very careful in allocating IPv4s and strongly wanted to be on IPv6. Of course, that effort's going to take a while.
Yeah.
We're going to see that migration for a long time.
Aaron saying cron jobs can go wild and use up all your IPv4 addresses in terms of just launching a ton of pods all at the same time. Is that what you're saying, Aaron? Yeah, I could definitely see that being a failure mode.
There's a cleanup controller for that.
Yes, that's one of the things we're going to be getting to here. And then finally, I just want to give a personal shout out to Liz Rice, who she's at Isovalent now, was at Aqua, has been on the TOC for the CNCF, for 3 years now. And I worked with her when I was on the TOC, and she, amazingly dedicated, really did a great job of helping to lead and really brought it. I think, there's, with things like the TOC, and I think, we see this, with the steering committee also, not everybody brings the same level of commitment to these types of positions. There's a lot of folks that view it as a position to be held, not a job to be worked. And, and I can definitely say with respect to Liz, she took it seriously and definitely viewed it as a job to be worked. And so, huge thank you and shout out to her for her 3 years of service for the CNCF on the TOC. All right. So that is the notes that I had. Did anybody else have any other sort of things? Oh, and then the let's see if we can do a quick Google search here. KubeCon virtual deal, $10. Let's see if let's see. This says last chance. Is the last chance? Has it already expired? I don't know. Let's see. So hopefully you didn't miss it. Oh no, maybe we missed it. Okay, well, shoot. I'll remind people here to register for virtual KubeCon. Register for virtual KubeCon. There we go. All right, so it looks like maybe the deal actually passed, but there we go. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. What I'm going to do, Ray, is I'm going to go through stop sharing so that they can see us. But if you want to see the notes and some of the topics that we're going to be hitting, feel free to pull that up. It's at the tgik.io/notes for all the folks watching. Also, if you want to, you can, these notes are always available after the fact, and I'll put it down here at tgik.io/notes-180. So that should work also. That's a stable link that'll work over time. So there we go. All right. So I'm going to stop sharing this and take it away, Ray. What are the things that you, okay, let me start off by saying thank you for doing the work of being a release lead. Like talking about Liz doing the stuff for the CNCF TOC. This is not a position to be held. This is a job to be worked. And it very much is. Can you tell me a little bit about, what it means to actually do one of these things? What does it mean to be a release lead? What does the release process look like? Give us a little bit of color on how that all pans out.
Yeah, so I'll start off with the release team first. So the release team is a group of volunteers from the community. We're from all different organizations and companies, small companies, big companies. I'm from SUSE by way of Rancher. We have students as well. It's made up of people who are experienced contributors to the project, or brand new contributors as well. So the team itself, it's responsible for the day-to-day operations on creating a release and organizing a release and coordinating a release. And what that means many different things. I'll go into
30 different jobs. I think this is one of the things that's fascinating, is that it's like there's so many positions, there's so many different things that go into a release.
Yeah, absolutely. And the lead itself, myself for 1.23 and James Laverack from JetStack, he's the release lead for 1.24. We're pretty much responsible for all the release activities and have that be that ultimate accountable person for all the release tasks. With that, there's 7 different roles in a release team, one being the lead. I'll just go through each one just a little briefly. So this is part of the release team. Enhancements is the tracks and guides enhancements that are targeting a release. They don't choose which enhancements that's going to be part of a release. That's probably one of the misconceptions about being on the release team, is that we're actually choosing things and we're actually making the decisions. It's not. We're actually helping guide and aid and organize things so that the process and the release process itself kind of goes through as smooth as it can. So enhancements helps track enhancements that are targeting a release. Enhancements are worked on by special interest groups of Kubernetes or SIGs. So there's many different SIGs, and they opt in for what enhancement they want to be part of a release, if it's graduating to GA or going to beta or introduced as alpha. So that's enhancements in a nutshell. There's CI signal that tracks CI to make sure that the quality of the release is great. And they monitor the boards to, if there's something goes in error, they make sure that it's triaged to the right SIG. Example, we in the past we've had some issues with some tests with like Windows and some storage, so they make sure that SIG storages and SIG Windows know about that issue and get that resolved. There's bug triage,
but there's a certain amount of like, if there's an enhancement and people want to make it and it's just not coming together and it's just not landing, there is a role for the release team to be like, if we're going to keep the schedule, this isn't coming together, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's part of the
Not everybody wants to hear that.
Exactly. Like we do make sure that all the code PRs are in, and make sure all the tests are valid. And also they're passing to, and there are plenty of times where we do have to remove a enhancement from a release, and they can file for exceptions as well in case they want to. If they know exactly, like, we just need one more day to work on this PR, and then we could take that into account, and part of that decision making, I guess. And we bring in the SIG leads and folks from the release team as well to help decide if that exception should be granted. So,
all right. Well, and so I know in the notes, you put some links there, and we can go into this maybe a little bit after we go through sort of your favorite enhancements and sort of what people need to know about the release. But, you have sort of about the release team and how you can, get involved in all, in the various roles and all that. And I think, we're always looking for fresh faces and new ideas and new energy, right?
Yeah, we always love new contributors, and just the whole project in general. The release team is great because there's actually a structured process to help you become a contributor, and like it helps you get those PRs in. It actually gives you a look into the landscape of all those repos. They can be very confusing at first. I know it was very confusing for me. So it kind of gives you that guidance, and you have a mentor. Like each role has a lead, and they mentor shadows, and shadow is an apprentice. And one of the roles of the role lead and myself as a lead is to mentor shadows so they could take our place and they could step up.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, and it's a great way for folks to get involved. So yeah, if anybody watching, live now or, catching the replay of this wants to get involved, there's the resources there in the notes. And I'm sure, Ray wouldn't mind if you reached out and asked about it. And, he can definitely point you in the right direction there. Yeah. All right. Let's see. Carlos is saying that he is a shadow for the release notes for 124.
Congrats.
So thank you for doing that, Carlos.
Yeah.
And release notes seem like the type of thing, like, how hard can it be, right? You just have to write some release notes. But it turns out it's not easy.
Yeah. And actually I started out with release notes in 1.18, and some of the shadows of my team actually refactored the program to generate the release notes. So one of the goals is to automate ourselves out if we can, or for some teams. But so we tried doing that, and some of the shadows did refactor and actually created a better program or replacement program for it.
Yeah, I know, like just early on looking at the history of the project, it's always been a struggle to actually filter through all the PRs and figure out what are the changes that really matter to folks. And like things like in a PR, you can like say, hey, is this release note relevant or not? But even then, like being able to actually pull out which of those things matter, how do you categorize them? How do you actually make it be, relevant to, a particular area, particular SIG or persona in terms of like, hey, are you using Kubernetes? Are you administrating Kubernetes? Like the Docker shim stuff, if you're just a Kubernetes user, you probably don't care about Docker shim. It probably won't impact you. But if you're a Kubernetes administrator, it's definitely something that may impact you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right. Well, okay, so let's start going down your favorite enhancements here. This is a list that you sent me, heading up into this. But feel free to add more stuff or reorder these things in any way that makes sense to you. What do you want to start with?
Let's start off with dual stack. Since we kind of touched base on dual stack, and so dual stack was GA'd in 1.23. People might be a little confused. Like there was a KubeCon keynote in 2019, and there was another one this last and the last KubeCon in Los Angeles in 2021. Dual stack was actually introduced as alpha in 1.15. Like I mentioned before, it was refactored in 1.20. It was because of that service. You had to have a service per IP family. So it was refactored in 1.20. 1.20 kind of went through the alpha beta the stable phase again. So 1.20, the service API did support dual stack. And then now it's stable in 1.23.
So this has been around for a while, but the news is that it's now done.
Yes, absolutely.
Definition of done. I think, this is something that I think is really interesting. So number one is that for those, that aren't familiar, so the idea with dual stack is, look, you can have something that speaks IPv6, v4, right? This is what we all know and love. And then there's v6, and actually doing v6 with Kubernetes has worked okay. I don't know how many people are actually doing it for quite a while. But the idea with dual stack is that you can actually have programs speak either IPv4 or v6, and that way, if you're only a v6, server or client, v4, that'll work. Same thing with v6, and there's sort of interoperability and sort of across these things. And so there's a lot of places where we go from saying something has one IP address to it has multiple IP addresses. Depending on sort of, whether you're talking to v4 or v6, and that ends up being a pretty big change for sure. And then I think there's also a lesson here about how careful Kubernetes is in terms of taking something to GA. And I think this is a difference between open source and products. With products, it's a customer says we need to have v6, let's get it done hook or crook. And it's there's some awkwardness with respect to services and the way that you use those with dual stack. If there was that product pressure, people would have been well, ship it anyways. We need to make the customer happy. But I think, there's a lot of counter pressure with open source to say, hey, let's do it the right way. Even if the timelines look crazy, we still need to make sure that we get it right. And I think this is a great example of that.
Yeah, and the whole getting things right as well. I just want to tag on this. So there's actually a production readiness review process that is now part of the release team process. So it is required for a release. It means that enhancements going into release has to be reviewed by a few selected folks who have, who are part of the production readiness team or production readiness review team, and they make sure that those enhancements are ready or production ready. So.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, this was some of the ideas when we were instituting the KEP process, is that pre-KEP, it was just chaos in terms of what made it into a release. And we wanted to start saying do we have one place where you can go to get the idea? And I think, again, the maturity of the project, right? I think, a lot of people have a love-hate relationship with KEPs, right? There's a lot to be done. There's a formality to it. But that also means that hey, if we ship something and it's not ready, if we break something on accident, that's definitely, something that our users notice. And we're past the point where we can just YOLO stuff in for sure. That's how we got to where we're at right now.
Exactly. And yeah, we're all trying to make the process better. And we hear what's going on in the community with SIGs about the KEP process. So we're always trying to improve it.
All right, let's keep going. So what do you want to tackle next?
Let's go down the list.
All right.
So everyone should know that pod security policies will be removed. It's already been deprecated, but will be removed in 1.25. PodSecurity Admission Controller is the replacement of PodSecurity policy. So that is now beta in 1.23. There is a great blog. I'll probably link it with a little tutorial as well on how to implement PodSecurity Admission Controller. So it's another admission controller where that can admit or deny pods from running based on what the user states on the. There's based on the pod security standard that defines that the user defines. And there's 3 different pod security standards that you could do as well. So it's privileged, baseline, restricted. But one of the big changes, I guess, it's applied to the namespace level with a label on a namespace. So if the namespace itself, let's say you said it's you want it all pods can be privileged. So that's one thing that's introduced. It's applied to the namespace level with the PodSecurity Admission controller and with PodSecurity standards.
Okay, whereas like before, I think folks try to get super fine grain, and like, and this is something that I think, it takes a while for people to really truly understand, is that like the security sort of cordon really is the namespace for a lot of the stuff in the control plane. I mean, going finer grain than that, there may be a couple places where you can do it, but it's really hard to get too much more fine grain than the namespace from a security point of view.
Yeah.
Now, do you have, can you summarize for folks, and this is, I may be putting you on the spot, like, there has been a saga similar to the Docker shim stuff around, pod security policies. They were released. They were, I believe, never made it past alpha. But at the point in the project, people are like, we need this. So a ton of people started using it. And it was a especially painful thing to back away and say, hey, this isn't the right solution. Even though alpha meant that was still possible according to the deprecation policy, practically so many people have taken a dependency on it. This was a particularly painful transition here. Do you have, can you summarize for folks why, PSPs were deprecated and why the pod security admission stuff is better?
Yeah.
Or do you
I know a little bit.
I mean, is this one of those?
I know some of the APIs for pod security policies didn't follow the same, I don't know, want to say formats, or wasn't logically correct in a way, and
So
you can't back
just
out
the
of it.
way that it applied just
Yes.
felt kind of weird. Yeah.
Yes. And so I know that's one of them. That's one I hear the most from internally within the project. So they wanted to apply, we want to do things correct. So pod security admission controller is that. And I know folks use third-party admission controllers. I mean, there's OPA or APA Gatekeeper. There's Kyverno, which a lot of people from my work work on as well. So there's different. So it's not just pod security policies. You have to use pod security policies, or you have to use pod security admission controller. But there's other third-party admission or other tools that you could use as well.
Yeah, lots of ways to skin this cat for sure. Yeah, I think the thing for me with pod security policies is that like it was sort of an explicit schema, and it was clear that like there was always going to be new things to lock down and new ways to evolve that. And it's like, it didn't feel like it was going to evolve well as we added more and more things that you wanted to lock down with the platform over time, right? I think that for me was like, okay, what does this look like after we play out another 10 versions? Is the pod security policy going to be like 300 entries long to be able to do anything, right? I think that was for me what I saw happen in there. So yeah,
and I still see a lot of customers and users. I actually was on a call today working on about pod security policies for a customer. So I know people are using it quite a bit, and so just want people to be aware that it will be removed in 1.25. So start looking at options.
All right. So so the next one we have is the TTL controller. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so we have a new cleanup controller. It's a bit of a garbage collection. So as we saw in the chat, there's some issues when a job finishes. Those pods remain. Yeah, those IPs, virtual IPs, still there. So there's a new controller called the TTL controller. It cleans up jobs of cron jobs and pods of jobs. So that went to GA. So it means that you have the ability to clean up those jobs and pods after they finish. There's a new field. It's in spec for the job, like TTL seconds after finish. So that needs to be set. So you determine how many seconds after finish, and the controller watches all the jobs and compares the TTL seconds after finish with the last transition time, and if it's greater than now, deletes that job or pod of jobs.
Okay. And so because it's like seconds after finish, there's no like wall clock thing, which introduces time zone issues and all that. It really is like based on that. Now, this only applies to jobs and pods of jobs, right?
Yes.
So this is in the job spec, not in the pod itself.
Yeah, it's in job
Now,
spec.
do you know, like, was there any talk of actually having more generic TTL controller? Because I know, like, one of the things that we'll see, a not uncommon pattern would be, hey, you have a cluster doing CI/CD stuff, and you start to bring up some resources or a namespace per run, right? And you want to be like, hey, this namespace under no circumstances should it be around, an hour from now, right? Or 2 hours from now. So there's definitely places where you could think that like a TTL might actually make sense beyond just pods and jobs.
Yeah, this is
Do you
the
see
only one
any
I'm
discussion
aware
around
of.
that with this one?
But there is some more garbage collection things, and I'll talk about a little bit later for 1.23. Well, I call them as garbage collection, but
Yeah. Okay. So there's some people are looking at that in the more sort of general way,
yes.
moving forward. Okay. Awesome. So Carlos says need to use V1 for this stuff, right? Yeah, oftentimes I think features like this are only exposed in the latest API versions.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, secrets TTL. I think finalizers are always something that is so easy to stub your toe on those things, and like, why won't this thing delete?
I see that every week.
Yeah. All right. Next one.
All right, HPA, the horizontal pod autoscaler, V2 API is GA. That brings in the ability to support custom metrics, multiple metrics. I do want to make a note that the V1 API is not being deprecated. Just that you could use the V1, you could also use the V2. There's just no plans currently for the V1 API being deprecated. Might in the future. Just want to make note of that. Yeah, so there's a new behavior field you should look into. It's called behavior to use this.
So this is, I mean, so the fact that like we're going to have multiple versions running concurrently is really interesting, and that's going to be it's going to be interesting to see how that pattern plays out and whether that's something that influences new features being introduced in the future. As we look, so say like the gateway APIs are on networking, right? How are we going to actually be able, like, clearly, like, there's a lot of sort of back to the drawing board thinking and some really interesting ideas coming from that. But clearly we're not going to want to, like, deprecate a lot of networking APIs all of a sudden. That'd be hugely disruptive for folks. My advice on, and I'd love to get your opinion on this, Ray. My take on it is that for so many folks, the complexity of doing sort of metrics driven auto scaling may not be justified, and that you can get away with having something that just sort of like based on the diurnal cycle automatically scales things up and down. Like you just have sort of a time-based auto scaler. You could like, there's a cheap and cheerful that is like a heck of a lot more predictable, less dangerous, and probably gets you 80% of the benefit there.
Yeah, I
How
totally
often do you
agree.
see folks, using HPA? How often does it work for them? Do they get in trouble? I'd love to get your experiences on that.
I've seen HPA used quite a bit. For the most part, it's great. I mean, I have no complaints about it, and we definitely use it in our products or projects from SUSE or Rancher Labs. So have not seen any big issues. I'm sure there are.
I just, for me, I think, the classic thing here is that, if you have an app, and if the bottleneck, and you're like, oh, I'm going to, like, based on sort of like CPU usage or based on request rate, I'm going to scale. And it's very easy, like if the database ends up being your bottleneck, that you end up scaling the front end, and it just makes matters worse because you're now actually creating sort of a larger fire hose pointed at sort of that. So I think that's one of the hardest parts with auto scaling, is making sure that it's sometimes it's very difficult to automatically identify where the bottleneck is, and oftentimes you might end up scaling the wrong thing and actually make things worse. Yeah.
There's also vertical pod autoscaler. Just a question out to you: how often do you see people use it?
I think the original, so Borg supports doing in place vertical auto scaling. And so what you end up doing is and especially if you need to shrink something, you can always shrink something and actually give back but opportunistically, you can then actually, increase the resource usage of say a pod in Borg speak without actually restarting the pod. Right. And I think the dangerous thing with vertical auto scaling is that to impact it, you need to actually kill and restart the pod to be able to do that. And so I think it's fundamentally limited based on how well behaved is the application. If somebody's like a super modern application, totally, 12 factor, has all of their different health checks and availability checks, readiness checks all set up well, and you're doing things like disruption budgets and such, I think it can probably work really well. But that's a big if, right? I think there's so many applications that are in transition where it's like they can take a little bit of disruption, a little bit of restarting, but if you hit them too hard, they fall over. Especially when you're viewing things like, hey, oh, it takes me 10 minutes to start up because I have to prime all my caches. That type of thing can really impact you. Now, Carlos is saying that the difference here is swap memory. I don't know, man. Swap is dangerous, right? Because what you end up seeing is that the performance, with and without swap it's like a different machine that you're running on, right? It goes from like, you're running at this thing, and as soon as you hit swap, your performance drops through the floor, and that doesn't necessarily end well for anybody. And so it's not uncommon in these cases to be like, look, if you need swap, right, you're already in a failure mode and you need to actually go up and fix something. So yeah. So Prasad says that there's in-place VPA. I know we talked about that for a long time. I'm not totally up on what's going on there, but I think vertical scaling in place, that's a little bit of the holy grail, but that's a hard thing to be able to do because now you're going through and you're like, hey, we have to plumb that all the way down to the CRI to be able to start doing that stuff. It's a much more difficult feature than doing it just at the sort of the control plane level. Similar things for any sort of a live migration, right? Like these things go hand in hand. If we had live migration of pods with in-place vertical, then it's like, well, move this thing over here where there's room and then scale it up. Eventually, maybe we want to get on that, but there's a race between supporting that versus having the apps be more flexible and be more resilient and sort of being built the right way to some definition of right. So I don't know, does that fit with your experience, Ray?
Yes.
I do think that there's room for more standard sets in terms of advice, because I think when people are writing their initial pods, it's like, how much RAM do you need? How much CPU? And like most application devs are like, I don't know, give it like, 4 CPUs and 4 gig, right? That's probably enough. And then you'll find that they use like a fraction of that. So I think being able to collect history and then give advice, even if you don't apply it automatically, that's definitely, I think, something that definitely makes a ton of sense. And I think there's definitely room for more tools to be more widely deployed that are between, YOLOing it and guessing and overestimating and then automatically applying it, which is what you get with VPA.
Yeah, the application has to be profiled. That's what I suggest.
Yeah. And I think part of the problem is that, like, what defines an application, right? I think sometimes people will key it based on the underlying container image, right? But you can run the same container image in very different ways. Maybe it's the deployment, maybe it's a set of labels, maybe it's the container image plus the namespace, but it ends up being actually difficult to be able to say, like, what are the set of characteristics that I want to group so that I can actually then predict and profile this stuff over time, because we don't in some ways Kubernetes is too flexible in terms of being able to run a bunch of things.
Yep.
All right. Keep moving.
All right. Yeah. So next one is Ephemeral Containers goes to beta. And so Ephemeral Container supports a new command called kubectl debug, which is another enhancement. But with Ephemeral Containers, you can launch an Ephemeral Container within a running pod and you share those pod namespaces. So the intention of Ephemeral Containers is to observe those other containers in the pod and to debug it. It's difference, between kubectl. I mean, you can always exec into container, but that's just starting a process. But with kubectl debug, you could start a new pod and and so you could do all your troubleshooting there. This is one of my favorites because I do tend to troubleshoot quite a bit.
So I haven't actually had a chance to sit down and play with Ephemeral Containers. So I want to ask you about this a little bit. So you're launching another container in the pre-existing pod, right?
Yes.
Okay. I think, some of the reasons behind this is that as we look towards sort of, rootless and minimalist containers, you're not going to have a lot of the tools. You may not even have a shell on there to be able to actually exec into and do. So you want to be able to have your ephemeral container bring the tool set with it versus assuming that the tool set's already there and installed in the container that you're trying to debug. So that all sounds great, but I guess do they generally work with sort of a combined process namespace? Do they generally how do you deal with, debugging the file system on the other containers? How does that generally work?
So I actually haven't tested out since it's been out, but it does have this. Of course, it has a shared network namespace and hostname namespace. Depending on what volumes it mounts on it as well, I don't know actually what ability you have to introspect into those file systems. But I do also want to say that so do some work with security as well. So just want to introduce that this also adds in possibly another attack vector. I mean, someone could also
debugging is always fraud.
Yeah, exactly. You could always, do a kubectl debug on your pod, and then you have another attack vector. So do want to state that as well. I know it's great for troubleshooting. I love it. I'm gonna love it for troubleshooting. Haven't had a chance to actually to test it since December. So that's a good point.
It would be, oh man, this stuff is fascinating. I haven't been involved in discussions, but I would love to see the capability of if you attach an ephemeral container, that adds a new sort of label onto the pod. And then you can have something that says we don't want any of these tainted pods to be able to live for too long because somebody might have screwed them up as they debug. I don't know. You got to think through the workflow there, but eventually you want to make sure that you get back to having everything be as clean as possible. Right.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you got to, do some more security profiles with this command when it does eventually become GA. So
yeah. So let's see a couple of comments here. So some questions around sort of a vMotion sort of live migration stuff. I don't know how widely that's, deployed. I think there's definitely people playing with that, but let me tell you, that's hard. And it's hard from the storage point of view and networking, right? So doing a movement and then making sure that both the network and the storage can follow it is not an easy problem. And I think, when we look at CNI, roughly there's two different types of CNI. There's CNI that actually has a pool of IP addresses per node. And this works really well with IPv6 because, a lot of times you can assign a whole subnet to that node, and that node then has its own sort of space. And then there's CNIs where the IP addresses aren't allocated to nodes. And so there's advantages and disadvantages to these. If they're not pre-allocated, you can be more efficient in terms of IP space usage, but it's slower to be able to allocate an IP because you have to go to some IPAM system and say, give me an IP and assign it to this thing and make sure everything's routed. Whereas when you sort of pre-allocate IPs to a node, it can be a lot more efficient to be able to get something up and running fast. It's going to be very, very difficult to support any sort of vMotion when you have that pre-allocated IP per node. And so those are some of the things where this stuff, if you're just talking compute, it's one thing, right? Oh, let's capture some memory and some register state and move it around. But storage and networking is where this stuff really gets hard. And then Prasad was asking, was it Prasad? No, somebody was asking. Oh, Conrad was asking here. Are there tools for making better app estimates of resources at this time? I know that there are some systems out there that will do some profiling and help you sort of, make guesses. And I think you can run the vertical pod autoscaling in a sort of advise mode. And I think I did a TGIK on it. I know I played with it at one point, but I'm wondering, Ray or other folks in the chat, do you have experience with this in terms of these sort of profiling app estimates type stuff?
Most of I was actually a profiler, but this was just gonna say my age, almost like at least 15 years ago, at least 15. And yeah, so back then I did a lot of Java profiling. So and not too aware of what are the current tools that the folks would use.
Yeah, I think it's probably a little bit dated now, but if you go, it's TGIK 126 is where we did that's where we did the vertical pod auto scaling. And let's see, I'm loading this up now and checking it out. Yeah, it was me doing this. And I believe, this is where you start looking at the metric server and all that. So it starts getting into a lot of that. And if I remember correctly, there is an advise mode there. So yeah. So yeah, Conrad, I encourage you to go check that out, because there's at least something there. And I'm sure there's community projects out there too that go beyond what's there. Yeah. All right. And then folks are talking about ePBF and using that for debugging. Yeah, definitely. You can get a lot of information there. But like at some point, nothing's, like you want to have a shell where you can do PS and see what's running. And it's somewhat difficult to do that through a lot of this sort of outside ePBF based stuffs in terms of being able to drive into that. All right, let's keep moving. We got 2 more items on your list here, Ray. We can make it through.
All right, sounds good. Next one is the auto remove PVCs from StatefulSets, which is now alpha. So this is part of that whole garbage collection kind of theme I have. So this is when you have a StatefulSets and you have those pods of StatefulSets have have a PVC, and you typically, when you delete StatefulSets, those PVCs are still around. But now you could have 2 options. When you delete the StatefulSet, it will remove those PVCs, or when you scale down that StatefulSet, it will also remove that PVC.
And by removing the PVC, then that may actually then cause the underlying volume to get deleted, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, because I think originally with StatefulSet, there was definitely a lot of paranoia. And this is some of what makes StatefulSets annoying, is that you can get them stuck in these states where they're like, I don't know what to do. I need manual intervention, because there's so much paranoia around losing data. And I think one of those paranoia decisions early on was very much, hey, we're not going to delete the claims because that may cause the data to get deleted, and we don't want to have anything that accidentally deletes your database out from under you. But it feels like there's enough experience now where we can start slipping in some of the garbage collection, some of the stuff there. But I think that's definitely one of those, like, use that with caution, right?
Yes, absolutely. Like, you should know your StatefulSet pretty well by then.
Yeah, exactly. All right. And then the last thing, this is exciting,
The
actually.
last one is the SLSA Level 1 compliance. So part of the roadmap for SIG release, and I'll put this in the notes as well, is making the software supply chain for Kubernetes more secure. And this is one of the first steps is as well. So SLSA is a framework. And so what Level 1 means is that the provenance attestation files are generated, and those describe the staging and release phases. It also means that we know exactly which artifacts, where they come from, and to verify that there's no middleman in there, that's there's nothing unexpected from it. It also means that the build process is fully scripted and automated as well. So we have those the provenance attestation files available. It's actually a little bit more steps in it as well. It's like we're not just having those files available. They're available in the buckets, but we also use those files to make sure that we verify that the stage artifacts or the artifacts are correct.
So as you go from stage to stage,
Exactly,
you're actually going back to those files and being like, did somebody slip me something in here in between, and actually revalidating it? Okay.
yeah, exactly. So it makes the whole software supply chain more secure. There's 4 levels of SLSA compliance, and the project itself already complies to various amounts of SLSA levels 1 to 4. Like the 4th one, which is the most secure, states requires 2-person review of all the changes, and so we almost have that. I'm like, we have someone do an LGTM, and someone has to do, another person usually does an approve on pull request. So that's already kind of there. So we already have a lot of those steps between.
You don't have people
levels.
just slamming stuff in.
Exactly. So our goal, of course, is SLSA Level 4 compliance, the highest level of SLSA compliance.
Now, this is really exciting stuff, because I think, more and more everybody's getting paranoid about supply chain. and open source. And I think, and beyond just the security stuff, there's an aspect to this around licensing, right? It's very easy to take a dependency on something and that may not actually have a license that we're okay with. So a big part of this is actually being able to have that manifest, that bill of materials. What are all the ingredients that go into this? Making sure that we know that, and then you can actually go and do things like license compliance checks and all that.
Yep. So
yeah, and
as
that's a
project,
journey.
that's a journey. And as a project mature goes on, we'll make sure that software supply chain is more secure each time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Alex brings up the log4j stuff, and I think it's a matter of time before it's easy to sort of say, oh, that's just a Java problem, but like there's going to be a problem someplace in sort of a Go, standard library at some point where everybody's going to scramble. Hopefully it's not going to be as bad as log4j. Let's keep our fingers crossed. But like, this is not the last time we're going to see this type of fire drill. This stuff is going to actually get much more prevalent. And I think, part of the problem is that, it's so hard right now to even know, does this impact me? Am I even part of this, right? And at least, with the SLSA, with being able to map the supply chain, you can at least know what you're running and have some sort of, confidence that what you're running is what you think is running. Yeah. So yeah, Carlos is saying SLSA would not have helped for log4j, but it would help with the remediation after the fact to know whether you're impacted with log4j. Now with Java, you can go through and crack the jar open and actually start looking at symbols. So that's another way to see if you're impacted from log4j. But like with something like C++ or Go, figuring out, oh, are you using this API after the fact may not be easy, right? It may not be an easy thing to do. All right. Yeah. So Carlos says the supply chain is before runtime. It's like, yeah, how do you go from source code to artifact and then know that as you deploy that artifact, it's the thing that you think you're deploying and you know all the things that went into it. All right. So that is a quick rundown of everything in 1.23, or at least the new most exciting stuff. Any other stuff as we've been talking, Ray, that sort of comes to mind that you think is interesting that you saw as you sort of saw all the different enhancements and everything come through?
Yeah, so there's a few. I'm gonna just quickly say
okay, so we'll do a little lightning round here.
Yeah, when's the kubelet container runtime interface? The CRI for kubelet went to beta, so this is something we need before the Docker shim removal. Another thing for software supply chain as well. Taint-based propagation analysis. It's a type of analysis where you. Oh, let me go back.
Wait, what's it called again? It's called.
I think it's called taint-based propagation analysis. But let me do a summary. We did external security audits of the project in 2019. We found out that secrets are logged several different places.
Oh, yeah, that's not good.
Yes. So this tool or this type of analysis sees where data is moving within an application. So there's a tool, GoFlowLevy, which takes a look to see if you're logging secrets. Pretty much that we're running this tool in the pre-submit. So any pull requests that is merged the tool will be run, and we know that if your KKPR, if your code PR is logging secrets anywhere. So this is something that we've added in 1.23. So I just want to keep that in mind. It's just so that we're to prove that we're trying to make the project stuff more secure.
Yeah. Any other things?
That's pretty much it. I mean,
that's enough.
Yeah. There's a whole lot more, but
yeah, go read the release notes.
Yes.
And then finally, Carlos is asking, what is 124?
So that cycle actually starts on Monday. Then I think the release is April. I forgot what day in April exactly. The release cycle is 15 weeks. It's 15 or 16 weeks depending on the time of the year. So usually the end of the release or the end of the year cycle is usually 16 weeks, and everything before that is 15 weeks. And that's from when we went from a 4-release cadence to a 3-release cadence. So it'll start January and in about April.
Awesome. And CokeGen in the chat is saying, hey, can we do a TGIK on V4, V6 dual stack? Yeah, that was actually one of the alternate topics that we were talking about here. And I need to find the right way to set that up and actually play with it, right? Because it's like getting a good test environment for dual stack is, as part of the battle here. It's so easy to fall into that V4 everything seems to work type of motion. So yeah, all right. Well, I'm gonna give so Carlos saying PSA only Kubernetes only supports the last 3 releases. Tell your friends to update often. That is definitely something that is a concern. I think we've been talking on and off for quite a while around doing an LTS and finding a lot of folks together to sort of make that happen. A lot of complications on there, and there's a danger with an LTS also is that if people get too far behind, doing one of these updates that may actually be difficult and they may not, right? So there's LTS is a little bit of a trap here also. So I think, making it easier to roll forward is also, is in my mind the preferred thing, but not everybody can do that. And then I think we're also at this point, we're down to 3 releases a year, right?
That's correct.
Yeah. So we were at 4, it's down to 3. That takes some of the pressure off the release team because it is a big job. And it also means that sort of that last 3 version support policy actually means more in terms of time too. So that helps to mitigate that a little bit then also. But 3 releases a year is still a lot. It's still a lot of work. All right. So any other folks in the comments have something? Otherwise, like I'm gonna let Rey have the last word here and just say thank you so much, Rey, for joining us. Really appreciate you taking the time, and also thank you so much for being the release lead for 1.23 and it's not just this release. You've been putting the time in over multiple releases to get to this point. Any last things that you want to say here?
I just want to thank you, Joe, very much for having me. It's been great talking to you. You're sort of one of my idols in the Kubernetes space. So read your book, of course. Yeah, this is great for me. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being part of it, and thanks so much for all your work making the community go. I really appreciate it, man.
Thank you very much.
All right, everybody have a great weekend. Let's see. I think, next TGIK, we're actually, if you go to tgik.io/repo, that'll go to the GitHub repo. And we actually have a bit of a schedule and we have a TBD for next week. So we'll go ahead and figure that out. I will actually see if we can get somebody who can sign up to do the dual stack demo, because I think that'd be a lot of fun. I'm not sure I necessarily have the depth at this point to be able to set it up, but I would love to see somebody demo that. But then also coming up on the schedule is we're going to be looking at Carpenter, which is our supply chain coordinator that runs on top of Kubernetes to sort of really help coordinate a bunch of tools. Really some good, interesting ideas going on there. Sana, and that's Cartographer, not Carpenter. That's going to be February 11th. Carpenter is just-in-time nodes. This was the AWS one, right? It was the AWS cluster auto scaling stuff. That's what Carpenter is. So that's going to be in 2 weeks. But I'll see if I can find somebody to do the dual stack for next week. Thank you so much, Rey, and everybody have a great weekend. Yeah, maybe we can twist Josh's arm into doing the dual stack stuff. And talk to you all later. Stay safe and healthy. Thank you.